As we continue our journey of this nature-nurture debate and looking at what's shaping John and what's influencing him, that's causing him to grow up to be strong in the spirit, we see that he's influenced by a number of things. We've seen that he's been influenced by the power of parenting. We've seen that he's been influenced by that presence of partnership, that sense of being connected to the Holy Spirit. We see that he's been influenced by the culture around him and the corrupt nature of that. And we're also seeing that there's this other influence where he is called to be a prophet in the spirit and strength of Elijah. And he's growing up in Ein Kerem, in the spring of the vineyard, in a region that's called the Bordeaux of ancient times, surrounded by vineyards, but himself not being allowed to touch a drop. I believe all these influences shape him, and as a result of this, he's seeing with the eyes of the prophet. But in Jeremiah 2, we see that this prophetic voice of the prophet Jeremiah, speaking to God's people, he accuses the people of abandoning the fountain of living water. And so just as God doesn't abandon his people, we see that the Israelites have travelled through not only the wilderness and spent 40 years as a result of not taking God at his word, and then entering the promised land, and after a promising start they have this fickle nature that constantly swings from periods of trusting God to not trusting God to trusting God to not trusting God, and they end up being carried away into exile. And Jeremiah is a prophet around the time of the people being carried into exile, because, as he says, they've abandoned the fountain of living water. In other words, they've taken themselves away from being connected to that spring, where God has brought them into a land that's flowing with milk and honey and is full of springs that are bringing fertile nature. Despite all of God's goodness, the people have abandoned God and go their own way. Jesus, when he came, he talked about meeting people's innermost need by springs of living water coming up. He promised living water to people, and that was one of the themes that Jesus spoke of when he spoke to people. And no doubt, having ministered in areas and looked at the barren land and looked at the nature of springs, Jesus was using some of the images to underpin his message. And that wouldn't have been lost on John, having grown up in a place called the Spring of the Vineyard. John's mission and his message was to call people back, and he recognised this need to be connected to the spring, because the spring of living water is a permanent presence, and what Jesus offers to people is a spring that will never run dry. We need to access that spring of living water, that source, and sometimes we don't do that. We need to accept the invitation that we have to be connected to God and to put our roots down and experience that ongoing sense of the presence of God and the living water. John's experience shapes his understanding of the nature of God. As he grows up in this area, I believe, looking around him, he saw with the eyes of the prophet, and he was able to see God's message through his surroundings, and God was downloading something of his heart and his message through what he was seeing. What's our understanding of God? Somebody once said, if you feel alone, you feel God's not with you, then who moved? And I can promise you it wasn't God. That's what we see throughout the message of the Old Testament, that God offers this permanent source of living water, but his people chase after other things rather than come and stay connected. And when Jesus came, he's described as Emmanuel. And Emmanuel means God with us. Emmanuel's not just for Christmas. When Jesus returned to heaven, he promised to be with his church till the end of the age, to be with his people to the end of the age. He promised to be Emmanuel permanently. And when we look at that source of living water, not only do we see a promise of the Holy Spirit and being connected to the Holy Spirit, we see a promise that Jesus will remain Emmanuel and God with us. You may be going through tough times at the moment. You may be looking around you and experiencing some things through this pandemic that we've maybe never experienced in our lifetime. And we have an invitation. Are we going to stay connected, or are we going to disconnect and go our own way? Are we going to be part of that vine that's connected together by branches and connected to this spring of living water that grows up permanently? Or do we think we can do it ourselves? In the Garden of Eden, when God said, you can eat of any plant, any tree, but not from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and we see Adam and Eve eating from that tree, there was a sense of saying, even though God's given us everything we need to live a fulfilled, perfect life, connected with Him, we took the lie that the enemy said that there's more to life than this. And you and I are no different. We've done the same thing. And the invitation that we see to be connected to the spring is to rediscover that sense of being connected to the permanent source of living water, Emmanuel. Are you connected to God's people? Are you connected to His church? Are you connected to Emmanuel? Or are you trying to go it your own way?